Hello. Welcome to a Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining us again today. Did you know the leaders of the Sons of Liberty stayed back in the Old South Meeting House in order to create plausible deniability during the Boston Tea Party?
Did you know that before Paul Revere was a midnight rider, he was a Tea Partier?
And in Annapolis, one man was so shamed that he was trying to sell tea in the port that he burned his tea and his ship to try to restore his patriot reputation. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will learn about that and more in episode 46, The Boston Tea Party.
That's right. All the tea.
Hello, everyone. Welcome into another episode of A Teacher's History of the United States. Much appreciation to you for joining us today. As you can probably tell, I am a bit under the weather right now. My voice is a bit strained. I am sick, and things at work have made it much more difficult. I've tried to hold off a couple days on recording this podcast, hoping it would get better, but it has not. So sorry about that. But I am joined today by Mr. Bill Gorman again. Bill, welcome to the show, my man. And you said you wanted to begin the episode today?
I did, and I know you accuse me of not listening to the pod, but I do. And I heard you thank the listener last week, and I wanted to take a moment and also say a sincere thank you for listening, for subscribing. For those who have not left a review, if you're a frequent listener, you will know that Chris oftentimes throws me under the bus for any one-star reviews that are left on iTunes. So if you have not left a review yet, please stick it to Chris. Give us a review on iTunes that maybe turns the tables on him for once. But I did want to say a sincere thank you.
Well, Bill, to be fair, I accuse a lot of people of a lot of things, so you are not that special. And we did ask the listeners for ratings and reviews a couple episodes ago, and they came through for us big time. I think we got over 15 ratings and reviews in the first day, so that was fantastic. And I mean, we really can't thank you enough. Speaking of thanks and appreciation, I know because of my voice and the recording schedule being thrown off, this is not being released on Teachers Appreciation Day like I had hoped, but it is still Teacher Appreciation Week, and I wanted to give my appreciation, and Bill and I both give our appreciation for all the teachers out there. As many of you know, I no longer teach. I've sold my soul to the business world, fell on the wrong side of my Faustian dilemma. But I very much appreciate teachers and what they do and all the work they put in for the young generation of Americans and one day my children. So thank you for that.
That's not all the news we have, Chris. One more piece of housekeeping. Chris and I are actually taking a weekend adventure into Philadelphia. Obviously, we're coming up on the Boston Tea Party. If you're listening to this episode, you know that. And so we are in the thick of it. 1773 revolution is a brewing. So we figured where better to be than a place like Independence Hall. And I think it's going to be a real neat trip. If any of the listeners of the pod are in the Philadelphia area, please feel free to reach out to Chris or me on Twitter or hit us up with an email. It would be awesome to meet a few of you over beers, coffee, adult beverages. I don't know if I'm allowed to say beers.
Well, Bill, I think people know that Philadelphia has beers. I think we are allowed to say that. We are of drinking age. But yes, if you want to grab a pint or a cup of coffee with us to meet up in Philly, that would be awesome. We'd really love that. So yeah, one more thing. As you've probably noticed, Zach hasn't been on the pod for a while. He has been gallivanting in Spain. So hopefully after Zach gets back and settles back down in Houston, where he lives, we will get him back on the pod here soon. And one last thing. In the next few episodes, we are going to be having a bobblehead giveaway. And if you go to our website, www.ateachershistory.com, there will be a form right on the front of the website for you to enter your information to enroll in the bobblehead giveaway. And they're presidential bobbleheads. I had a bunch of them. I had them like all over my desk in my classroom. The kids loved them. And my wife thinks I'm a child, but that's okay. And so we'll be giving them away with a personalized note from us, thanking you for listening to the show. So just fill in your info on the website, and you'll be put into the drawing for that. Bill, I know your favorite bobblehead is FDR.
Oh, yeah. I mean, FDR, all things FDR. So it's my favorite one. Obviously, no shock to listeners of the podcast, but yeah, FDR.
Yes, mine is John Adams. I'm a big John Adams fan. I think he's very underrated. Some of my students said their favorite presidential bobblehead I had was Ben Franklin, who was not a president. But that's okay, right? Nobody's perfect. So let's jump right into it. I would love to review last episode just real quickly here. And we spoke last episode about how after the Tea Act in May of 1773, the tea was cheaper the East India Company tea was cheaper than it previously had been. Now, one thing that's interesting to note, and I didn't really bring up last episode, is that the colonists, by the time they found out about the Tea Act, it had been a few months since it had been passed, and they did not have an opportunity to voice any type of opposition or frustration to Parliament and to the Crown after the passage of the Tea Act. By the time they found out about the Tea Act, there were already ships that had been commissioned by the East India Company with tea traveling over the Atlantic. So the colonists felt like not only was the Tea Act passed and these new restrictions were put into place, but they really did not even have an opportunity to speak out against this Tea Act.
Chris, did I hear you correctly when you said that tea actually became cheaper in the colonies after the Tea Act was passed?
Yes, the British tea was cheaper.
Right. So
Okay.
It was more of a rhetorical question, but thank you for answering it. So, one of the lines of thinking that led to the Boston Tea Party, I think, at least in the popular in the pop culture, is the idea of no taxation without representation, and that is assuredly a large strain in this entire conversation. But what's interesting about the Boston Tea Party, it wasn't higher taxes that actually led to the Boston Tea Party. It was simply the fact that they were being taxed without representation. So the dynamic at play is the colonists are getting cheaper tea. Now, you might be thinking, oh, great, that's a win-win. But if the colonists paid the duty on the imported tea, they would be implicitly acknowledging Parliament's right to tax them. So that's kind of a predicament they're in.
Without their consent.
Exactly. So that's actually the predicament they're in. It's a little bit of a stretch, but it's more about self-governance than it is about the crushing weight of taxes in this instance. We're going to come back to this on a handful of occasions about what Parliament was thinking, and it was nearly all dead wrong. Every bit of it.
Well, hold on a second. I don't think that's totally fair. Their thinking had logic. Parliament's thinking was reasonable. They were viewing it from a totally different perspective and from different experiences. I mean, I don't think there is a right or wrong in history. Things are not as binary as sometimes people make them out to be. And I think when people do make make choices and decisions in history, make them out to be right or wrong and good or bad, I think that's ignoring so many complications of human behavior and how decisions are made. And it's really not giving enough credit to the people who made those decisions. History is way too nuanced.
It's not that we're assigning a value to that statement. When the Parliament was taking a pulse and making decisions, a pulse of the colonies, that is, their pulse, their read on what the colonists were thinking, what they would do, how they would react, was wrong.
Well, yeah, okay. Well, yeah, I guess if that's what you mean by it, then yes, they were wrong.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
I will concede that. As mentioned last episode, the morning of December 16th, the group allowed Francis Roche one last time. So he was the owner of one of the ships in the harbor, and the Dartmouth. And they allowed him one last time to go to Governor Hutchinson and ask him, basically beg him, please let him take the Dartmouth, take his ship out of Boston Harbor. And Roche even came up with this idea that, like, hey, you can let me take my ship out and you can shoot a cannon with the Navy. You can shoot a cannon over my ship and make it look like you don't want me to take it out. So at least you then have plausible deniability. But Hutchinson was not on board with that. And he said no. He was not willing to use the Navy in any type of scheme. And Roche was not willing to unload the tea because he, did not want to get publicly shamed, tarred and feathered, economically and socially isolated and quarantined from the rest of Boston society, physical violence. Who knows what would have happened. But in the evening, as the sun began to set, Roche arrived back at Boston and the Old South Meeting House. And he told them, like I mentioned at the end of last episode, he could not unload the tea unless he was forced to do so. So here's a dude in front of thousands of people who is truly stuck between a rock and a hard place. Sam Adams then says, quote, "This meeting can do nothing further to change the country." Immediately afterwards, a group of about 20 men stood at the door of the Old South Meeting House dressed up as Mohawk Indians. Now, there's believed that there were a few other meetings going on at the same time as the Old South Meeting House, and they were happening simultaneously, and this is likely where all the men were preparing and getting their costumes on, etc. So, Bill, question to you. Why do you think it was so important? Because I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, when they do, head over to the wharf for the Tea Party, which we'll get to in one moment, why did the leaders of the Sons of Liberty stay back at the Old South Meeting House? And why did all of those who participate dress up as Mohawk Indians? If everyone knew who they were anyway.
Okay, let's unpack first why the most famous among, well, at least to us, why the most famous of the Sons of Liberty hung behind. I think the simplest way to explain it is that they wanted to make sure they had plausible deniability for what actions were about to unfold. When you're the most visible, highly visible members of this organization, one where the British certainly knew who they were, and they had targets on their backs as the biggest rabble-rousers in the Boston area. They were the ones who probably should be hanging back a little bit. They shouldn't be really on the forefront of this. As to why all the other Sons of Liberty and other Bostonians would dress up as Mohawk Native Americans, I think it's a pretty obvious answer. Again, deniability. If you're in disguise, it's going to be harder to be identified. And that's especially important if what you're being identified for is a treasonous offense, one that you could be executed for. So I think it was incredibly important for most, if not all of them, to disguise themselves in some way, even though by all accounts that I've read, the people of Boston encouraged all of it. Odds are they wouldn't be pointing the finger at any of them. However, there were loyalists, Tories, whatever you want to call them, among the people of Boston. And I do want to point out, some of my research pointed me to this, that this scheme to disguise themselves as Mohawk Native Americans was attributed to Sarah Bradley, who was the sister of Nathan Bradley, one of the Sons of Liberty in Boston, but she would go on to play a large role during the Revolutionary War. But I think it deserves, that stroke of genius deserves some acknowledgement.
Yes, shout out to Sarah Bradley. We haven't talked about a ton of women so far. We will talk about more as we continue this podcast, and I love to give credit where credit is due. So shout out to Sarah Bradley. And Bill, also, I think you hit the nail on the head with that description of plausible deniability. When you think about it, if after the event, someone went up to a member of the Sons of Liberty who they, knew participated in the event, and they accused them of it, the Sons of Liberty could say, no, sorry, I was at home drinking tea and looked like, I don't know, I heard from people, looked like a bunch of Mohawk Indians did it. I don't know what to tell you. So, anyway, these quote-unquote Mohawk Indians headed to Griffin's Wharf to commandeer these 3 ships and unload the tea from the ship.
Griffin's Wharf, and notably now an Intercontinental Hotel.
I hate when I expect something cool, historic, and unique, and then it's something like an Intercontinental Hotel. No offense to the Intercontinental Hotel in Boston. I'm sure it's lovely. I'm sure the people who work there are just dolls. But, yeah, I hate that. I have experienced that multiple times in many different places in America and throughout Europe. But I digress. So about 50 to upwards of 100 or 120 people, depending on which source you read, they do contradict each other. But anyway, a lot of men dressed up as Mohawks boarded the 3 ships in the Boston Harbor. And over the next 3 hours, they poured out 340 chests of tea into the harbor. One of the men said, "Boston Harbor, a teapot this night." The men boarded the ships, removed the customs officers from the ships and the crew from the ships. And one thing that I have found that surprises people is that the Boston Tea Party was not a secret. There were hundreds of people there watching this happen. And they were cheering, and this was a huge public spectacle. Now, why were they able to watch it happen, Bill? Where were the soldiers that were stationed in Boston?
Well, Chris, if you remember in the aftermath of the Boston Massacre, the British troops, and I think it's reasonable to say this, and reasonable to feel that way, were not treated well by the civilians in Boston. So they were evacuated to Castle William. So they weren't actually in the city. But the Navy, it should be noted, the British Navy was in the harbor. They were out there.
Yeah, they were, but that's far away. But yeah, either way.
I'm just saying they were there. But when you consider the artistic depictions of this act, you were just saying that perhaps some folks out there thought it was a covert action. But whenever I would see artistic depictions of it, there were pistols going off, people whooping, people in the street. It seemed to be a very, very public act.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I think the artistic depictions of it are more accurate than most people assumed the scene was like. I would ask my students about this, and they would often be very surprised at how public it was. They just had in their minds that these Mohawks snuck over in the middle of the night and unloaded all of the tea, and, it was something that happened in secret. So they were always just very surprised by that, and that's why I wanted to mention.
All that said, though, you're right. The only property in terms of being quiet in a way. You were right. The only property that was destroyed was the tea. The ship crew was unharmed. Only one Son of Liberty was actually injured. I mean, this was a pretty, in and out operation.
So over 400, each chest was over 400 pounds. In all, they dumped 46 tons of tea, which, by the way, is an insane amount of tea. It was extremely valuable, worth almost 10,000 British pounds, which is over 1 million British pounds today. So when they arrived at Griffin's Wharf, they split up between the three ships, the Beaver, the Eleanor, and the Dartmouth. And this happened in the early hours of the night. I mean, it was December, so the sun went down early. But we're talking like 6, 7, 8 p.m. They were pretty much had wrapped up between 9 and 10 p.m., which is also something people usually don't realize. Usually people think it happened like at 2 a.m. or something. It did not. It happened basically in the evening. It was low tide in the harbor. So the tea was, some of the tea was piled up higher than the water. And so some of the guys hopped out of the ship and hopped in little boats and went out and spread the tea out into the water to ruin the tea, to make sure that all the tea was ruined. One story that I always found a little funny is during this entire process, when the men go and they start boarding the ships, the captain of the Beaver, and the Beaver had just gotten there, I think a day or two before. So they just arrived. And so you can imagine, as these quote-unquote Mohawks are coming towards the ship, the captain of the Beaver's probably thinking, oh, you got to be kidding me. I just got here. Please don't destroy my ship. And so he asked them, look, I know you're coming after the tea. Please leave all the other stuff on my ship alone, please. And so they said, okay. And they took all his other stuff. They placed it on the docks, and then they just destroyed his tea. And I mean, probably my favorite anecdote in this whole thing is one of the men broke a lock on one of the ships, and they went out into town and they replaced the lock, because they genuinely did not want to destroy anything other than the tea.
Yeah, and on that note, let's take a listen to what Sam Adams had to say about all this. He said, all things were conducted with great order, decency, and perfect submission to government.
Yeah, and I mean, don't you love that quote? Oh, one last anecdotal story. During the tea party, there was one guy who tried to pocket some of the tea. He tried to steal some of the tea. He liked tea. He wanted the tea. And he actually got beat up and sent home. And, once again, no anarchy here. This is organized. We know exactly what we're doing. We have a plan, and we're going to carry it out. John Adams was enamored by the Boston Tea Party. He was very impressed by how they carried it out. John Adams said, quote, "This is the most magnificent movement of all. There is a dignity, a majesty, a sublimity in this last effort of the patriots that I greatly admire. This destruction of tea is so bold, so daring, so firm, intrepid, and inflexible, and it must have so important consequences and so lasting that I cannot but consider it an epoch in history." The next morning, Samuel Adams sent out notes to New York and actually had Paul Revere, and Bill, I know you're excited to talk more about Paul Revere in future episodes. Paul Revere heads down to New York to give them news of the Boston Tea Party. Then a messenger from New York heads down to Philadelphia to tell them about it. And I mean, as word spread of this was a huge deal. Like, this was way bigger than the Boston Massacre, the Stamp Act protest, the non-importation boycotts, etc. This was destruction of 46 tons of private property from English merchants and actually colonial merchants in the British East India Company. And remember, many of the politicians in Parliament owned stock in the East India Company. So when you think about this, this was a very entangled event. The tea is coming from Asia. The East India Company, one of the largest corporations in the world at this time, was the owner of the tea, and the ships were privately owned. The men on the ships were working privately. There were parliamentary investments in this. There were a lot of people involved in the response to the Boston Tea Party and involved as victims to the Boston Tea Party, and we will see how that all really plays out. The Boston Tea Party is that it was, it's always been known as the Boston Tea Party, but that's not the case, correct, Bill?
No, in fact, it was known at the time as the destruction of the tea, and I believe that's attributable to John Adams. It wasn't until 50, 60 years later, through art, through lore, that it became known as the Boston Tea. But Chris, I think it's always interesting when we hear from the big wigs. I mean, a future president like John Adams on the event. But
one of my favorite presidents, for the record.
I think that is in the record at this point. But I also think it is important to provide an account of someone who was on the ground, who participated. And I found a journal entry from George Hughes, who dressed up as a Mohawk, Native American, and took part in the Boston Tea Party. And he wrote, "It was now evening, and I immediately dressed myself in the costume of an Indian, equipped with a small hatchet, which I and my associates denominated with the tomahawk, with which, and a club. After having painted my face and hands with coal dust in the shop of a blacksmith, I repaired to Griffin's Wharf, where the ships lay that contained the tea. When I first appeared in the street after being thus disguised, I fell in with many who were dressed, equipped, and painted as I was, and who fell in with me and marched in order to the place of our destination. In about 3 hours from the time we went on board, we had thus broken and thrown overboard every tea chest to be found in the ship, while those in the other ships were disposing of the tea in the same way at the same time. The next morning, after we had cleared the ships of the tea, it was discovered that very considerable quantities of it were floating upon the surface of the water, and to prevent the possibility of any of it being saved for use, a number of small boats were manned by sailors and citizens who rowed them into those parts of the harbor wherever the tea was visible, and by beating it with oars and paddles so thoroughly drenched it as to render its entire destruction inevitable." End quote from George Hughes. Remember that name. One more thing from me, Chris. One of the outstanding pieces of myth, really, is that the entire town of Boston and the colony of Massachusetts, everyone was in favor of this. And many were, but many weren't. And there were a couple notables that were against the actions of the Boston Tea Party. One was George Washington. And it's not because he didn't detest what the British were doing, but it's because his belief in private property was paramount. He saw this as a complete violation of those principles. The other was Ben Franklin, and he actually offered to reimburse the company for the losses. I mean, like you said, that's a lot of money. He was a wealthy man, but I mean, to be so offended that he was willing to reimburse them, I mean, that's opposition, right?
Yeah, and Ben Franklin recognized the possible ramifications of this event. He was hoping that there could be and would be some type of reconciliation between Parliament and between the colonists. He truly did not have a dog in this fight. He genuinely had love and affection for England and Parliament and the role they played in the colonial system and for the colonies. And, his home home colony of Pennsylvania and the rights of the colonists. I mean, he really was torn between the two. In episode 48, we'll dive a bit deeper into how Ben Franklin got roasted in front of Parliament and how this treatment by Parliament really turned him once and for all against the king and parliament and in favor of colonial rebellion. But at this point, he was still pretty hopeful. So Parliament's reaction to the Boston Tea Party, which we'll dive more into detail about next episode, was unique in that they were infuriated at what the colonists had done. And some of them really were disappointed. I don't know if that's the right word or not, but they were, that the colonists did not even have the guts to show their face, that they did in disguise. They've made it even worse. Because they did it in disguise and because it was the worst kept secret in Boston, a lot of people did not write about this. And we had to wait. We, as in, people who study history and American history, the historians at the time had to wait to put together the narrative of this event because so few people spoke about it for so long. One thing that I've always found a bit odd that we haven't mentioned yet, Governor Hutchinson was not in town that night. He did not see any of this happen. I can only imagine that when he heard what had happened, he had to have been furious and embarrassed. I mean, just imagine you're Thomas Hutchinson, you're the governor of Massachusetts, and you're sitting down to write letters back to Parliament, and you have to include what happened, 92,000 pounds of tea destroyed, why he didn't or couldn't prevent it, and the fact that he really likely had no real way to find out who did it or convict anyone for the crimes. That is a difficult letter to write to your boss. Now, to give Hutchinson credit, which I really don't like to do, but I guess I will, he set up a privy council, and he did interview people, and he tried to find out who did it, but no one ratted on anyone else. And I mean, in the end, from one perspective, and I do want to say this, you could say that this Tea Party was bound to happen, and it was felonious. It was an act of lawlessness, and some people in Parliament believed it to be treason. But, the Tea Act had been debated for a while. Parliament, and I know it's very easy to look back in hindsight, and I genuinely try to do this as seldom as possible, but Parliament probably should have seen something coming, and there were members in Parliament who warned against some type of action. So it seems like a protest like this one had been building for a while now. The colonists had made their frustrations known for the past 8 years about taxation without representation, and Parliament just did not do anything to change their course of action. As I mentioned earlier in the episode, the Boston Tea Party, of course, happened in Boston, but there were a few other events in harbor towns that included tea. In Charlestown, which is present-day Charleston, South Carolina, the ship London arrived about a week after the Boston Tea Party, and it was seized and offloaded. The tea was put on the docks in storage, and it just sat there for 2 years. It was not sold. Now, depending on which historian you use for your references or which sources, some believe that it was sold a couple years later in order to help fund the revolution. Others say the tea went bad. Either way, though, the tea was not taxed, and the East India Company had to take losses on that tea. In Philadelphia, on Christmas Day, about a week and a half after the Boston Tea Party, the ship Polly was coming towards Philadelphia, and the captain of the ship had gotten word what had happened in Boston and that the same thing might happen to him. So he anchored his ship prior to going into Philadelphia, and he went into town to speak with the people of Philadelphia. And there are reports that there were upwards of 8,000 people there to speak to him, and they told him basically point blank, do not unload that tea or else. So he got the message. He said, all right, gotcha. Got back on his ship and peaced out back to England. In New York, the exact same thing happened. The captain of the Nancy got back way into town, got back on the ship, went back to England. Multiple other ships with tea were attempted to land in colonial ports, not knowing how angry the people were. One guy, like I mentioned at the tease at the very beginning of the episode, landed in Annapolis, and they made him burn his tea and his ship. Some say he burned it down on his own to restore his reputation in the area, but I guess we'll never know for sure one way or the other. But either way, that is a pretty dramatic and drastic action to take. Now, propaganda and sentiment against tea was beginning to spread throughout the colonies following these tea parties or tea protests. And in New England, it was pretty hardcore. In order to make sure they weren't drinking tea from London, even by accident, most New Englanders stopped drinking tea altogether because there's no way to prove exactly where it was coming from. They would have tea burnings, and they would pressure local communities to stop buying tea. They then would spread propaganda, even about the negative effects on tea and how tea weakened them and how they are part of a colonial system and they're supporting their subordination by drinking tea, etc. So this did have a ripple effect, especially throughout New England, with regards to tea consumption. And this is the very beginning, believe it or not, and, well, I mean, I guess it's easy to believe, it makes sense, of the colonists beginning to show a bit more favor towards coffee. And of course, coffee has become the caffeinated drink of choice here in the United States, for sure, and across Europe. As you pack up your things, consider the situation that many of the colonists found themselves in at this time. The reactions to the previous pieces of legislation passed by Parliament had resulted in rollbacks in enforcement and generally an appeasing attitude by Parliament, even if begrudging. But this one, the Boston Tea Party, this was going to be different. And a lot of people recognized that this movement that was spreading throughout the port cities and the colonies had taken on a different tone than the previous efforts. The reaction by Parliament, which we will cover next episode, and Bill, you'll be back next episode, right?
Yep, I'll be here.
Awesome. The reaction by Parliament will be unique in that they will once and for all come down hard on the colonists, making an example out of Boston and the colony of Massachusetts. They created a binary choice in both England and the colonies. You either support the colonial uprisings or you support the authority of King and Parliament. There really, socially and politically, will be no in between. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate, please, like always, feel free to reach out. Find me on Twitter at A Teacher's Hist, on Facebook, A Teacher's History Podcast. Shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. And if you could leave a rating or review on iTunes or wherever you access your podcast, that would mean a lot to Bill, Zach, and myself. All right, see you next episode.